Hey everyone. Welcome back to last video before bed. Today we'll be reading creepiest experiences with taxi drivers. Let's go. I hopped into the cab and gave the driver the name of my hotel, which I had carefully written down to avoid any confusion. The driver seemed friendly enough at first, but as we started driving, I noticed he wasn't following the directions on the GPS. I thought maybe he had a shortcut in mind, so I didn't say anything at first. But as we drove further away from the area I recognized, I began to feel a knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. After a few minutes, I realized we were in a part of the city that looked completely unfamiliar. I pointed it out to him and he just shrugged and said, "Oh, don't worry. I know a great route." My heart started racing as we turned down a dark alleyway. That's when he pulled over and said, "Here we are." I looked outside and saw that we were parked in front of an abandoned building. I felt my blood run cold. This isn't my hotel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He seemed unfazed, just chuckling and saying, "Oops, let me try again." I was already feeling uneasy, but I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I told him the name of my hotel again and he nodded, starting up the car. After a few more minutes of driving, he pulled over again. This time we were at a random gas station. "Is this it?" he asked with a grin. I was in full-on panic mode now, and I told him no, that wasn't my hotel either. At this point I was feeling trapped. I had no idea where I was and it was getting late. I decided to take matters into my own hands and pulled out my phone to check the map. I told him the correct directions, but instead of following them, he just laughed again and said, "Let's see if we can find it together." I felt that knot in my stomach tighten even further as we drove off again. After what felt like an eternity, he finally pulled over for the third time and I was nearly in tears at this point. We were now in front of a rundown, closed-down diner. "Is this your place?" he asked, still grinning like it was all a joke. I could barely speak, but I managed to say, "No. Please just take me to my hotel." Finally, I mustered the courage to tell him I wanted to get out. I knew I had to get away from this guy before things got worse. He looked a bit annoyed but eventually agreed and let me out on the side of the road. I quickly paid him and bolted, heart pounding in my chest. I ended up using a rideshare app to get to my hotel, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me when I finally made it. Alright, so I've got to share this creepy taxi experience that still sends shivers down my spine. It's one of those stories that feels like it could be straight out of a horror movie. A while back, I was in a new city for a work conference, and after a long day of meetings, I was feeling drained but excited to unwind. I decided to grab a taxi to a local bar where I hoped to meet some new people and shake off the stress of the day. When I hopped into the taxi, the first thing I noticed was that the driver, an older guy probably in his late 40s, seemed a little too chatty. He greeted me with a big smile and immediately started asking questions about where I was from. I mentioned I was just visiting for work and he seemed genuinely interested. But then he launched into this long-winded story about how he used to live in my hometown. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but as he rattled off specific streets and local hangouts, I started to feel a creeping unease. It was almost like he was trying to establish a connection, but it felt forced and uncomfortable. As we drove through the city, I tried to change the subject and focus on the sights outside the window, but he kept talking. He started mentioning how he was moving out of his tiny apartment and how he could really use some help packing up. I chuckled awkwardly, thinking he was just joking, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in closer and said, I could really use a hand. It's a big job and I'd be so grateful if you could stop by for a bit after I drop you off." That's when the red flags started popping up in my mind. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, maybe a little too friendly, but then it hit me. This was not normal behavior for a taxi driver. I told him it was really nice of him to offer, but I just wanted to go to the bar and hang out with friends. I tried to keep my tone light, hoping to defuse the situation, but he didn't take the hint. Instead, he became more persistent, almost insistent. "You seem like a nice person and I could really use the help," he repeated, his voice taking on a tone that felt oddly desperate. Each time he said it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up a little higher. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen if I actually agreed to go to his apartment. What if he was one of those people who took advantage of unsuspecting individuals? It was getting creepier by the minute and I started to feel trapped in the car, the walls of the back seat closing in on me. Finally, we arrived at the bar and I practically leaped out of the taxi before he could say anything else. I paid him quickly, my hands shaking slightly as I fumbled for my wallet. I rushed inside, trying to shake off the weird vibes that had settled over me during the ride. I took a deep breath, hoping that a drink and some good company would help me forget about the unsettling taxi ride. But here's where it gets really unsettling. As I settled onto a bar stool and ordered a drink, I glanced out the window and saw him. There he was, sitting in his taxi, staring at the entrance. My heart raced as the realization washed over me that he was waiting for me to come back out. I felt a chill run down my spine as I tried to focus on the chatter around me, but my mind kept drifting back to the taxi driver and his strange behavior. I ended up staying inside for a couple of hours, making small talk with a few people at the bar but constantly keeping an eye on the window. Every time the door swung open, my heart would skip a beat, half expecting to see him walk in. Thankfully, when I finally decided to leave, I peeked outside and saw that his taxi was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I still felt that lingering unease as I walked to my hotel. Ever since that night, I've been extra cautious about my taxi rides. I always make sure to trust my gut and pay attention to the driver's vibe. It's a reminder that you never really know who's behind the wheel, and sometimes the most ordinary situations can turn into something truly creepy. That experience taught me a valuable lesson about being aware of my surroundings and not ignoring those little warning signs. So, I have to share this creepy taxi experience that still sends chills down my spine. A while back, I found myself in a new city for a conference, and after a long day of sessions filled with boring presentations and endless networking, I decided to grab a taxi to a nearby restaurant. As I stepped into the cab, I was taken aback by how fancy the car was, way nicer than any taxi I'd ever been in before. It was an upscale sedan with plush leather seats, a sleek interior, and even mood lighting. I remember thinking, wow, this is a nice ride for a taxi. The driver was impeccably dressed in a sharp suit, looking more like a corporate executive than your average cabbie. He greeted me with a friendly smile that felt a bit too polished. I settled in and tried to shake off the weird vibe as we pulled away from the curb. As we drove, I noticed a cooler in the back seat. "Would you like a drink?" he asked in an inviting tone, almost too enthusiastic for a simple cab ride. I hesitated for a moment, taken aback, but then thought, why not? It's been a long day. He opened the cooler, revealing an assortment of sodas and bottled water. It felt oddly generous for a taxi ride, but hey, I was parched after a day filled with lectures. I grabbed a soda, but as I popped it open, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this was off. Who offers drinks in a taxi? Then, out of nowhere, he reached under the seat and pulled out a pizza box. "I have some fresh pizza here if you're hungry," he offered, flashing that same polite smile. At that moment, a mix of gratitude and suspicion washed over me. The pizza smelled incredible and my stomach growled at the thought of it. But still, I couldn't help but wonder, who offers pizza to a random passenger like that? It felt way too personal, like he was trying to lure me into something. As we drove deeper into the city, I made an effort to engage in small talk to ease my growing discomfort. "So, do you drive people around often?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation in a safer direction. He chuckled lightly and replied, "Oh, you'd be surprised at the kinds of rides I give. Some people really appreciate a little extra comfort." His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something unsettling in his expression, a glimmer of satisfaction as if he was enjoying my unease. With every passing second, my instincts were kicking in hard. The more we talked, the more I sensed a strange undertone in his voice. It was like he was trying too hard to make me feel at ease while simultaneously reminding me how special this ride was. "Just think of it as a VIP experience," he said, his gaze intense and unwavering. I laughed nervously, but my gut was screaming at me to be cautious. The city lights blurred past as we ventured further into unfamiliar territory, and I began to notice that the streets were becoming less populated. The vibrant, bustling energy of the city was fading into darkness, and the atmosphere outside felt heavy and foreboding. My heart rate quickened as I glanced back at the pizza, still sitting there temptingly. Part of me wanted to take a slice, but another part was screaming that this was too good to be true. Why would a taxi driver go to such lengths to make a ride feel luxurious? At one point he turned to me and said, "You know, I like to treat my passengers well. It makes the ride more memorable." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening. My mind raced as I considered the possibility of asking him to drop me off early. I think I'm good on the pizza," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my palms began to sweat. "Just the soda for me, thanks." He just smiled wider, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the car. "Suit yourself. More for me," he said with an unsettling cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't want to provoke him or escalate what felt like an already tense situation. I glanced at my phone trying to gauge where we were, but the GPS was acting weird, and a sense of dread crept in like I was being led into a trap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we arrived at my destination. I practically leaped out of the car, heart racing, and as I fumbled with my wallet to pay him, he leaned in closer and said, "Remember, not every ride is just a ride. Some are special." The way he said it sent a jolt of fear through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly unsettling. It was as if he was hinting at a darker meaning behind his words, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I hurriedly paid him, my hands trembling as I dropped the cash into his palm. He lingered for a moment, his gaze locked onto mine, that unnerving smile still plastered across his face. I turned and bolted towards the entrance of the restaurant, my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced back one last time and there he was, still watching me from the driver's seat, the pizza box open beside him, the slices untouched. As I stepped into the restaurant, I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure. The warm glow of the interior and the sound of laughter from other diners helped to ease my nerves, but the memory of that ride lingered like a shadow. I found a table in a corner, scanning the menu but unable to focus on anything but the bizarre encounter I had just experienced. Throughout dinner, I kept replaying the events in my mind. Who was that driver? Was he just an eccentric individual, or was there something more sinister at play? The more I thought about it, the more I felt the urge to share my experience with someone. After finishing my meal, I pulled out my phone and texted a close friend, detailing the strange ride. They responded with a mix of disbelief and concern, urging me to be careful and to always trust my instincts. Once dinner was done, I decided to call a rideshare service instead of hailing another taxi. I didn't want to take any chances. As I waited for my ride, I couldn't help but glance outside, half expecting to see that same upscale sedan pull up again. Thankfully, when my rideshare arrived, it was a standard vehicle, and the driver seemed completely normal. During the ride back to my hotel, I told the driver about my earlier experience and he nodded knowingly. "You'd be surprised at how many strange encounters people have in taxis," he said. "Always trust your gut. If something feels off, it usually is." His words echoed in my mind as he dropped me off safely at my hotel. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events again, trying to make sense of it all. The unease settled in my stomach, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just brushed against something deeply unsettling. In the days that followed, I avoided taxis altogether, opting for rideshares, and I made sure to stay in well-populated areas. So, I've been a taxi driver for over a decade now, and let me tell you, I've had my fair share of strange encounters. But one night stands out as the creepiest experience I've ever had on the job. I still think about it from time to time, especially late at night when I'm driving alone. It was around midnight and I was just finishing up my shift when I got a call for a pickup at a local bar. The place was packed, with music thumping through the air and laughter spilling out onto the street. I figured it would be a quick ride, so I pulled up and waited, watching people stumble out, some looking for their rides, others just trying to find their footing. A few minutes later, this woman emerged from the crowd and I swear my heart skipped a beat. She was striking, long dark hair cascading down her back, dressed in a tight black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, and a smile that could disarm anyone. As she slid into the back seat, I immediately sensed something was off. She leaned forward, resting her chin on the seat, and gazed at me with these intense eyes that seemed to bore right into my soul. "Hi there," she purred, her voice low and sultry. "You look like you've had a long night." I chuckled nervously and started driving. "Yeah, you could say that. Just trying to wrap things up. She giggled softly and I could see her in the mirror, her smile widening almost unnaturally. It felt almost predatory, like she was sizing me up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in a scene from a thriller. As we drove through the dimly lit streets, she started asking me personal questions: where I was from, how long I'd been driving, if I liked my job. I answered politely, but I could feel the atmosphere growing heavier, like a storm brewing. There was something about her that felt off, like there was a darkness lurking beneath her charm. Then she leaned even closer and whispered, "You know, I've always had a thing for taxi drivers." My skin crawled a little. "Oh really?" I replied, trying to keep it light. "Well, I'm flattered." But she didn't laugh. Instead, her expression turned serious and she said, "No, I mean it. There's something about the way you drive. It's like you understand the city better than anyone else." I glanced at her in the mirror and her eyes were locked on mine, wide and almost unnervingly intense. As we approached her destination, the streetlights flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. Just then, she suddenly reached out and touched my shoulder, her fingers lingering a little too long for comfort. "Can you take me for a little longer? Just to drive around the block." A chill ran down my spine. I was tired, and the last thing I wanted was to be alone with this woman in the dark, with no one around to hear a scream if things went south. I really should get you home," I said, trying to sound as professional as possible. But she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "What if I told you I could make this night unforgettable?" I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in a horror movie. Her tone was seductive, yet there was an underlying edge that made my heart race. I kept my eyes on the road, glancing back at her every now and then. She was practically radiating this eerie energy, and I was starting to feel trapped, like I was the moth and she was the flame. Finally, I made the decision to drop her off at her original destination. As I pulled up to the curb, she pouted slightly, her lips forming a sultry curve. "You don't want to have fun with me? I promise you won't regret it." There was something in her eyes, an intensity that made it clear she was serious, and I could feel my pulse quickening. "Thanks for the ride," I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. She opened the door but paused for a moment, leaning in closer again. "You know where to find me," she whispered, her breath brushing against my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. And just like that, she was gone, vanishing into the night like a wraith. I sat in my cab for a minute, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had dodged a bullet. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I ended up driving straight to the nearest gas station to take a breather and grab a coffee, hoping to calm my nerves. I sat there for a good half hour, sipping on the bitter brew while replaying the whole encounter in my mind. Every detail felt etched into my memory: the way her voice had dripped with seduction, the intensity of her gaze, and that lingering touch on my shoulder. I couldn't help but wonder who she was and what she had wanted. The night was silent, and the fluorescent lights of the gas station felt almost too bright against the backdrop of darkness outside. I glanced around, half expecting to see her lurking in the shadows, but the only company I had were a few late-night truckers and the bored cashier behind the counter. Eventually, I took a deep breath, gathered my thoughts, and decided it was time to get back on the road. I returned to my taxi, the familiar scent of leather and the hum of the engine providing a small comfort. As I drove through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. To this day, I can't shake that encounter. It's like she was a character straight out of a horror movie, beautiful, alluring, and utterly terrifying. Each time I pick up a passenger, I find myself scanning their faces, wondering if I'll ever come across her again. So, if you ever find yourself in a taxi and the driver seems nervous, just remember, sometimes it's not the driver you need to worry about. It's the passengers that can turn a routine night into a chilling tale you'll never forget. Oh man, I've got a story that still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. A couple of years ago, I was in a city I'd never been to before, visiting a friend. It was late at night, around 2 a.m., and I decided to call a taxi to get back to my hotel after a night out. When the cab pulled up, it was one of those older models, slightly beat up, but I didn't think much of it. The driver was this middle-aged guy with an unkempt beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't say much at first, just nodded when I told him my hotel. As we drove, I noticed that he kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, and it felt. Things got weird pretty quickly. As we cruised through the streets, he suddenly took a detour. This isn't the way to my hotel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He just smiled, a creepy grin that sent a chill down my spine, and said, "I like to take the scenic route." But the streets were getting darker, and the area seemed increasingly deserted. I started to feel panic rise in my chest when he turned onto a narrow, dimly lit road lined with trees. "Is this really necessary?" I asked, my heart racing. He just kept driving, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening. The cab was silent except for the sound of the engine, and my mind raced with all the horror stories I'd read about. Then, out of nowhere, he turned to me and said, "You know, I don't get many passengers at this hour. I usually drive alone." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual but clearly failing. He just chuckled, that same unsettling grin on his face. "People don't like to be out late. I wonder why that is." At this point, I was frantically scrolling through my phone trying to figure out where we were. The GPS was acting up and I couldn't get a signal. I felt completely trapped. I decided I needed to act fast. "Hey, can you pull over? I think I left something at my friend's place," I said, forcing a nonchalant tone. He just laughed again and said, "You're not going anywhere until we finish our ride." My heart dropped. I had to think quickly. "Look, man, I'll pay you extra if you just let me out here," I pleaded. To my surprise, he suddenly slammed on the brakes. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness. I didn't even wait for him to respond. I flung the door open and bolted out of the car, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't look back as I ran down the road, my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like forever, I found a small diner that was still open. I rushed inside, panting and shaking, and told the staff what had happened. They called the police for me, and I waited there, terrified and paranoid, until they arrived. They assured me I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly sinister. The police later found the taxi driver, and it turned out he had a history of similar incidents. I still get goosebumps just thinking about that ride. Alright, so I have to share this super creepy taxi experience that still scares me and confuses me. It all went down a few months ago when I was visiting a new city for a friend's wedding. The night had been filled with laughter, dancing, and a little too much champagne. After the reception, I decided it was time to grab a taxi back to my hotel since it was pretty late and I was feeling a bit tipsy. I hopped into the cab, and the driver seemed friendly enough at first, with a warm smile and a casual greeting. But as soon as I settled into the back seat, things took an unsettling turn. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror and said something like, "You look like you know how to have a good time." I chuckled nervously, thinking he was just trying to be funny. But then he followed it up with a comment about how he loved picking up pretty girls like me. My stomach dropped. It was one thing to be friendly, but he was crossing a line that made me feel vulnerable. I tried to change the subject by asking him about the city, hoping to steer the conversation to safer ground. "What's the best thing to do around here?" I asked, forcing a smile. But instead of answering my question, he just kept making these suggestive remarks. "You know, I could show you a much better time than your boring hotel room," he said, his grin widening in a way that sent chills down my spine. My heart started racing and I felt trapped in the back seat. I was in a city I didn't know, and I had no clue where I was going. As we drove, the city lights blurred past, illuminating the darkened streets. I could feel the tension building in the cramped space. I tried to stay calm, but every time he glanced at me in the mirror, I felt more and more anxious. It was as if I could sense his eyes lingering on me, making my skin crawl. I thought about asking him to pull over so I could get out, but I didn't want to provoke him. Instead, I attempted to play it cool, but when he said, "I can be really accommodating if you're interested," I felt a surge of panic. That's all right," I managed to stammer, forcing a laugh that felt hollow. I tried to focus on the passing scenery, but my mind was racing. The streets felt increasingly lonely, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer in the dim light. I glanced out the window, hoping to spot something familiar, but the buildings looked foreign and intimidating. My heart pounded as I silently cursed myself for not calling a rideshare instead. The driver kept talking, his voice dripping with an unsettling charm. "You know, I see a lot of girls like you come through here and they all end up having a great time," he said, his tone almost conspiratorial. I could feel dread pooling in my stomach. What does he mean by that? I thought as I glanced at my phone, debating whether to call someone or check my location. The idea of being stranded in an unfamiliar city with a driver like him made my skin crawl. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of uncomfortable silence punctuated by his off-color remarks, we pulled up to my hotel. Relief washed over me, but I was still on edge. I quickly fumbled with my wallet, trying to keep my composure. As I handed him the fare, he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "You know where to find me if you change your mind," he said, his grin unsettlingly wide. I didn't turn around, I just bolted out of the taxi, my heart racing as I hurried into the hotel, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Once I was safely inside my room, I tried to shake off the whole experience. It was so unsettling that I couldn't sleep for hours. I kept replaying the ride in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was he just being a sleazy driver, or was there something more menacing behind his words? The way he had looked at me, the way his voice had dropped, it felt predatory. The next morning, I finally worked up the courage to check my bank statement and saw that I had been charged an extra fee for the ride, which was odd. I called the taxi company to ask about it, my voice trembling as I described the driver. They assured me he was one of their safest operators, and my confusion deepened. How could someone who made me feel so frightened be considered safe? It felt like gaslighting, an eerie twist that left me questioning my own perception of reality. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I started second-guessing every small interaction. It was all so weird. So, I had this super creepy experience while I was in a taxi a while back that still gives me chills when I think about it. I was coming home from a late night out with some friends, and I decided to grab a cab instead of waiting for the bus. It was around midnight and the streets were pretty quiet, which was a bit unsettling in itself. As I got into the taxi, I noticed the driver was an older guy, maybe in his late 50s. He seemed friendly enough at first, asking me how my night was and making small talk. I was too tired to really engage, so I just gave him short answers and stared out the window. But then things took a weird turn. About halfway through the ride, the driver suddenly asked me where I lived. I told him my neighborhood and he seemed to perk up. "Oh, I know that area well," he said, and then he started talking about how he used to drive in that neighborhood years ago. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it felt like he knew a bit too much about the streets. When we finally pulled up to my place, I was relieved to be home. I paid the fare and started to get out, but then the driver turned to me and said, "Hey, do you use Facebook? I'd love to stay connected." I was taken aback and just nodded, thinking he was probably just trying to be friendly. Then he pulled out his phone and asked for my name. I gave it to him, and before I could even process what was happening, he had already sent me a friend request. I was too stunned to say anything, and as I got out of the car, I could see him watching me through the rearview mirror. Once I got inside, I checked my phone, and sure enough, there was a friend request from him. I was so creeped out I didn't know what to do. I debated whether to accept it or ignore it, but my gut told me to just block him instead. I mean, who asks for a stranger's Facebook in the middle of a taxi ride? To this day, I still wonder what his intentions were. It was such a weird and unsettling experience, and I definitely learned to be more cautious about who I share my info with.